you ever wondered how a single baby could threaten the most powerful empire on earth? How could one infant's cry shake the foundations of a kingdom that had stood for centuries? What kind of child could make the mightiest Pharaoh in the ancient world tremble with fear? Well, the answer lies in a story so incredible, so filled with divine intervention and human courage that it changed the course of history forever. This is the story of Moses, the deliverer who rose from the banks of the Nile to become the greatest leader Israel would ever know. But here's what most people don't realize about this story. The birth of Moses wasn't just a miracle. It was the beginning of the greatest rescue mission ever attempted, a mission that would require plagues, miracles, and the parting of the Red Sea itself. And it all started with a mother's desperate act of faith and a basket floating on the river. Drop a 777 in the comments if you're ready to discover how God transforms the impossible into the inevitable. Trust me, this journey through Exodus will leave you amazed at how divine timing works in ways we never expect. The story begins in a place of unimaginable suffering. Picture this. The descendants of Jacob, once welcomed as honored guests in Egypt, had become something entirely different. They were no longer visitors or even residents. They had become slaves. The very people who had once saved Egypt from famine under Joseph's leadership were now grinding under the weight of Egyptian oppression. Can you imagine the irony? The nation that owed its survival to an Israelite had turned its saviors into servants. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The Israelites weren't just surviving their slavery, they were thriving. Despite the backbreaking labor, despite the cruelty of their taskmasters, despite every attempt to break their spirit, they kept multiplying. The Bible tells us they were fruitful and increased abundantly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty so that the land was filled with them. This wasn't just population growth. This was supernatural multiplication that defied every human explanation. Now imagine you're sitting on the throne of Egypt, the most powerful nation on earth, and you're watching this happen. You're seeing a foreign people within your borders growing stronger by the day. What would go through your mind? This is exactly what happened to the new Pharaoh who arose over Egypt, one who did not know Joseph. Think about those words for a moment. He did not know Joseph. This wasn't just historical ignorance, this was willful forgetting. This was the erasure of inconvenient truths that didn't fit the narrative he wanted to believe. Fear began to creep into the heart of this mighty ruler. Not fear of armies or neighboring kingdoms, but fear of babies. Fear of families. Fear of a people whose only weapon was their faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Pharaoh looked at something that reveals Israelites and say the depth of his terror. Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us. Can you hear the paranoia in those words? This was a man who ruled the ancient world's superpower, yet he was afraid of slaves who had no army, no weapons, and no political power. What kind of force could inspire such fear in the heart of absolute power? The answer is simple yet profound: the force of divine promise. Even Pharaoh could sense that something supernatural was at work among these people. So Pharaoh devised a plan. If he couldn't stop the Israelites from multiplying through oppression alone, he would make their lives so unbearable that survival itself would become impossible. He set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. The Israelites were forced to build supply cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. Every brick they made, every stone they carried, every drop of sweat that fell was designed to break their bodies and crush their spirits. But here's what Pharaoh didn't understand about the nature of divine purpose. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. Oppression wasn't weakening the Israelites. It was strengthening them. Hardship wasn't destroying their faith. It was refining it. Every cruel command, every impossible quota, every act of brutality was actually preparing them for something greater than Pharaoh could imagine. When oppression failed to achieve his goals, Pharaoh escalated his strategy. He commanded the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill every male child born to the Israelite women. Think about the horror of this command. These weren't soldiers on a battlefield. These were newborn babies, innocent and defenseless. Yet Pharaoh was so consumed with fear that he was willing to commit genocide to protect his throne. But here's where we see something beautiful about the character of ordinary people when they're faced with extraordinary evil. The midwives feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. When the most powerful man in the world commanded them to murder children, they chose to preserve life instead. They let the boys live. Can you imagine the courage this required? Every day they were choosing between the wrath of heaven and the wrath of earth, and they consistently chose to honor the God of life over the God of death. When Pharaoh discovered their disobedience, he demanded an explanation. The midwives gave him an answer that was both clever and true. The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Whether this was literally true or a divine protection over their deception, God honored their courage. The text tells us that God dealt well with the midwives and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. Frustrated by the failure of his secret genocide, Pharaoh made his command public and even more brutal. He charged all his people, saying, "Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, but you shall let every daughter live." The Nile River, which had been Egypt's source of life and prosperity, would now become a graveyard for Hebrew babies. The very waters that sustained Egyptian civilization would be turned into instruments of mass murder. This is the world into which Moses was born, a world where his very existence was a capital crime. A world where his first breath was also supposed to be his last. A world where the most powerful empire on earth had declared war on Hebrew infants. Yet in this darkest moment, when hope seemed impossible and survival appeared hopeless, God was preparing to do something that would echo through eternity. The stage was set for a confrontation between heaven and earth, between divine promise and human pride, between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. And it would all begin with one baby, one basket, and one mother's desperate act of faith. The child who would change everything was born into this atmosphere of terror and death. His name was Moses, though he wouldn't know that name for years to come. His parents, Amram and Jochebed, looked upon their newborn son and saw something extraordinary. The Bible tells us he was a beautiful child, but this wasn't just the natural affection of loving parents. The Hebrew word used here suggests something divine, something that marked this baby as special in the eyes of heaven itself. For 3 months, Jochebed managed the impossible. She hid her son from the eyes of Egyptian soldiers, from the ears of informants, from the brutal machinery of Pharaoh's genocide. Can you imagine the sleepless nights? Every cry from the baby could mean discovery. Every knock at the door could mean death. Every moment was borrowed time in a world where Hebrew boys were not allowed to exist. But babies grow, and voices get stronger, and hiding becomes harder with each passing day. Jochebed reached a moment every parent dreads, a moment where love demands the impossible. She could no longer keep her son safe in her home. The choice before her was heartbreaking. Watch him die in her arms, or trust him to the very river that had become a graveyard for so many Hebrew children. What happened next reveals the kind of faith that moves mountains and parts seas. Jochebed took an ark of bulrushes, daubed it with slime and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. Notice that word, ark. This wasn't just any basket. This was the same Hebrew word used for Noah's ark, the vessel that preserved life through divine judgment. Even in her desperate act, Jochebed was creating a miniature ark of salvation. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. Jochebed didn't just throw her baby into the river and hope for the best. She positioned him strategically in the reeds where the water was calm, where the current wouldn't sweep him away, where someone important might find him. And she stationed her daughter Miriam nearby to watch, to witness whatever God would do with this act of faith. The timing of what happened next wasn't coincidence. It was providence. Pharaoh's daughter came down to wash at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. Of all the people who could have discovered this floating basket, it was the one person in all of Egypt who had both the power to save the child and the heart to want to. When she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to fetch it. Picture this moment. The daughter of the man who had ordered the death of every Hebrew boy was about to open a basket containing exactly what her father had commanded to be destroyed. The woman whose father had turned the Nile into an instrument of death was about to use those same waters as an instrument of life. When she opened the basket and saw the baby crying, something remarkable happened. The text says she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." She knew exactly what she was looking at. She knew this was a Hebrew baby, one of the very children her father had ordered killed. She knew that saving him would be an act of defiance against Pharaoh's decree. Yet compassion triumphed over command. Love conquered law. The heart of a woman overcame the hatred of an empire. But God's plan was even more intricate than rescue. It was restoration. Young Miriam, who had been watching from a distance, approached Pharaoh's daughter with a question that seemed innocent but was actually inspired. "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women that she may nurse the child for you?" The princess agreed, and Miriam ran to get the one person who could nurse this baby better than anyone else in the world, his own mother. Think about the beautiful irony of this moment. Jochebed, who had been forced to give up her son to save his life, was now being paid by Pharaoh's daughter to care for him. The woman who had hidden her child from Egyptian authorities was now officially employed by Egyptian royalty to raise him. The baby who was supposed to die in the Nile was now being protected by the very family that had ordered his death. Pharaoh's daughter adopted the child as her own son and gave him a name that would echo through history. Moses, because I drew him out of the water. But Moses wasn't just being drawn out of water. He was being drawn into destiny. He wasn't just being saved from death. He was being prepared for deliverance. Every day he spent in Pharaoh's house, every lesson he learned in Egyptian schools, every skill he acquired in the palace was preparing him for the moment when he would stand before Pharaoh and demand the freedom of his people. The boy who should have died was now being raised as a prince. The Hebrew child who was marked for destruction was now being trained in the very halls of power he would one day challenge. The baby whose cries could have meant death was now growing up with access to the finest education, the greatest resources, and the most influential connections in the ancient world. But growing up in Pharaoh's house didn't make Moses Egyptian. Deep in his heart, the call of his true people remained. The blood of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob flowed through his veins. The promises of God were written on his soul. And one day, that divine destiny would collide with earthly comfort in a way that would change everything. And so we reach the end of this extraordinary beginning. From the banks of the Nile to the halls of Pharaoh's palace, we've witnessed how God transforms the impossible into the inevitable. A baby who should have died became the deliverer who would set a nation free. A mother's desperate faith became the foundation for the greatest rescue mission in human history. A floating basket became the vessel that carried hope itself. But here's what strikes me most about this story. Every act of courage we've seen, from the Hebrew midwives who chose life over law, to Jochebed who trusted her child to the river, to Pharaoh's daughter who chose compassion over command, reminds us that ordinary people can become part of extraordinary purposes when they align themselves with heaven's plan. The baby Moses, drawn from the waters of judgment, would one day part those same waters for deliverance. The child saved by an act of faith would grow to become the leader who would teach an entire nation how to trust God through impossible circumstances. The boy preserved in Pharaoh's house would return as a man commissioned by the God of Israel to say those unforgettable words, "Let my people go." This is how divine timing works. This is how God prepares deliverers. This is how hope survives even in the darkest moments of human history. The birth of Moses wasn't just the beginning of one man's story, it was the dawn of freedom itself. And if God could use a floating basket and a mother's faith to launch the greatest deliverance in biblical history, imagine what he can do through your life when you trust him with the impossible.